Welcome to the first lecture of the semester. This lecture will be relatively brief and focus on ways to think about sports fan identity. This will obviously carry us through a lot of the semester and discussions of sort of behaviors, attitudes, what makes up a fan. A lot of different ways to think about it, so let's get started. So the term fan, depending on who you're talking to, can mean a lot of different things. And even in academic circles, social circles, it's really hard to define what exactly makes a fan. Is it the amount of knowledge that they have about a sport or about a team? Is it related to the behaviors that they do? Is it somehow tied to the investment that they make, either financially, emotionally, the time that they spend with it? What exactly makes up? Perhaps it's love. Love of the sport, love of the teams, love of the culture. But again, if we're looking at terms that are really hard to define, fan might be one of them, but love might be even harder. And we're not even really getting into sort of maybe the levels of being a fan. So there's real fans, authentic fans, super fans, casual fans, fans of the sport, fans of a player, fans of teams. So there might be different levels based on all of these metrics. Maybe none of these metrics make any sense and you just kind of know if you're a fan or not. But a lot of our interactions amongst fans is really sort of presentation, showing that we belong, that we're one of the team or we're part of the group. A lot of identity work is really about presenting ourselves to others, to show that we belong and we fit in. So let's have our first discussion item of the semester. So at this point, you would also have a window open of your discussion posts. So in the forum for week one's discussion post, you'd put an answer in for what does it mean to be a fan. Think about it in terms of your experience, maybe classes that you've had that could help kind of inform what it means to be a fan, and then also discuss levels of fandom, real fans, average fans, super fans, casual fans, and what maybe the differences are between those levels. So take a moment, pause this presentation, and hop over to the discussion post and answer these items within your discussion post. Remember not to submit it right away. Wait until you get through all of the discussion items and all the lectures for this week, and then submit once you've done all of the discussion. All right, now that you've done your first discussion post item, let's move on with the lecture. All right, so defining a fan in this lecture is really going to be about actions and identity in sort of the direction or the flow of what comes first. Does the identity come first and then actions come out of identity, or do actions come first and they really define who we are? And depending on the position that you take is really freeing or restricting depending on how you look at it. For instance, if our actions define identity, we have maybe a bit more fluid identity and we can just choose the actions that we want and define ourselves that way. On the other hand, if identity is central and sort of innate inside us, it gives a sort of a deeper sense of self and a deeper, perhaps purpose even, and it's less fluid, it's more knowable, more reliable. So let's look a little bit deeper at the post-structuralist identity, and this is where actions define identity. So think of it as an outward actions moving in on identity. We might think of this in terms of norms or sort of the social rules of being a fan. So what is expected of fans, behaviors at the workplace, behaviors at home or in school, behaviors at the arena or at the stadium, around campus. So there are certain norms of any sports fan culture. For instance, at the University of Alabama or throughout the state of Alabama, the norm of saying "Roll Tide" after just about everything. Other norms of sports fan culture would be flags, home decor, things that you wear to work or school, really any number of things that serve as kind of identity pegs, calling out to other members of the fan base, I belong, I fit in. And this might even go so far as how we treat other members of our fan base, how we treat opponents, how we treat the ref. All of these are social norms related to fan culture: cheering, booing, screaming at the ref, getting visibly upset when there's a bad call, and also rituals about tailgating or what you do on game days, how you interact with other fans at the bar watching the game. So this explains a lot of what we might see as rational behaviors because we're trying to present a certain identity or fit in with a certain culture. We're choosing those types of behaviors or those attitudes that sort of most are most desirable by that culture. So again, to sort of maybe make an example out of this, we'll say a Butler sports fan, Butler men's basketball sports fan, has a number of actions and attitudes and behaviors that would sort of serve as identity-related actions to others, so that they're seen as being a Butler sports fan. So first thing that comes to mind is usually clothing that people wear, wearing jerseys or Butler colors. Obviously, actions like going to the games, being season ticket holders, but then even at the game itself, behaviors towards other fans, high-fiving after a big basket, behaviors towards the ref in the game, booing, hissing, shouting out the ref for a bad call, behaviors toward the opponent. This might vary based on culture, so maybe Philadelphia Eagles fans have a pretty bad rap for being sort of very aggressive and verbally assaulting of their opponents, but Butler fans maybe are trying to present a different type of action or behaviors toward opponents. Maybe they're seeing it more as being respectful, being good sports, depending on the values of the culture, really define what behaviors are desirable toward opponents. Other things might be food and drink, so some sports fan cultures have a lot of alcohol mixed in, tailgating mixed in. Other types of identity displays in this post-structuralist identity would be how you behave on social media, posting about the games, posting about how upset you are about a game, workplace or school presentations. So if you talk about Butler sports a lot, or if you wear Butler clothes to school or to work a lot, all of these are presentations to others to show that sort of you fit in, this is who you are, this is your identity. So in a way, this might be seen as somewhat freeing. You can choose to cheer for whatever fan base you want. So I grew up in Northwest Iowa, not a lot of pro sports teams up there, a lot of Hawkeye fans, I suppose, but you could really choose whatever teams you wanted. So I liked Bo Jackson when I was a kid, so I cheered for the Raiders and the Royals. So in a way, you might think of it as a sort of a very free exercise. I can be whatever I want to be or be whoever I want to be, which is generally seen as a positive thing. On the other side, though, nothing is certain, nothing is stable. You would sort of constantly have to be proving yourself that I belong. I'm one of the members of this group. There isn't sort of a deeper sense of identity. This is who I am. This is how I was born. I was born to be whatever, this type of fan or this type of person, really, if we move outside of the world of sports. So there's kind of both sides of the coin here, where you're not stuck with an identity, but there isn't maybe sort of a deeper, more meaningful substance to yourself that you can kind of hang your hat on no matter what happens. This is who I am. I know my identity. I know myself. So if we're thinking about this in terms of norms or the sort of the social rules that you're supposed to follow if you're in a sports fan culture, many times these norms carry well beyond sort of the activities or the attitudes related to the specific sport itself. We see examples of where it carries over to alcohol consumption or overconsumption as a norm of the group. So in a lot of tailgates throughout sort of the Big Ten, SEC, ACC, there is sort of the social norm of consuming alcohol for hours prior to kickoff. In some cultures, especially maybe we can think of hooliganism in the European soccer leagues, cultures of violence, riots after winning championships, either professional teams or perhaps violence and rioting after losing a big game as well. So letting off some steam. We'll talk about catharsis here in a little while, but sort of the social norm of it is what we're focusing on here. The norm of violence or rioting or flipping cars and lighting dumpsters on fire after we win a championship as a social norm. Also as a norm is seemingly irrational financial decisions. So when an impoverished city decides to pay billions of dollars in taxes to keep a team in their city, to build a new stadium, and they're paying billions of dollars for an organization that is making hundreds of millions or billions of dollars on their own, it seems like that would be an irrational decision, at least from an outsider's perspective. The difficulty, though, is understanding what might seem as irrational to one as rational, but depending on your perspective. So if the sports fan identity is so important to the sports fan culture or the individual, then it might not be seen as irrational in their minds. It might be seen as a very rational decision of, I'm paying X amount of tax dollars to keep this team that I love and this identity that's so important to me in my city. So I always want to be mindful when I'm thinking about irrational or rational behaviors of so much of it is based on perspective, and what's prioritized for one group isn't necessarily prioritized for another group. So if you're looking at maybe a financial planner who's examining that you're spending, I don't know, a third of your annual salary on season tickets to the Yankees, that might seem like a irrational decision. But if the individual is such a fan and their identity is so deeply ingrained with the New York Yankees, to them it seems like a rational, sort of important decision, important part of their life that they would spend just about any amount of money for. Now, this example of the New York Yankees fan that's spending a ridiculous amount of their, or percentage of their salary on Yankees tickets, really is getting at more of a structural version of identity where the sense of self and the identity is so built into who we are that it controls our actions, our feelings, our emotions. So that person might think that inside, in their heart or in their soul, they are such a Yankees fan that they have no other choice but to have Yankees tickets and do all the other things that I talked about in terms of actions, behaviors, attitudes. So it's really of where the locus of control is. Is it outside actions that are defining the self? Or is it the self, the identity that's inside you that is sort of driving all these actions that in some way that you might think that there'd be less control over? So this would get to explanations that allow for rational behaviors or irrational behaviors. Again, so much of that is based on your perspective on where you're coming from. But in the case of fans committing violence or binge drinking or spending an exorbitant amount of money, we might think of that as more of that's who they are. They can't even really control it. They have to do it if they're going to be true to themselves. So taking this structuralist identity, this sort of center-out identity a step further, the identity drives everything. So it drives how we interact with others in relationships, our attitudes, our behaviors, our reactions, our rituals, emotions, the goals of what we're trying to accomplish is all based on sort of who we are. And the pros and cons of this center-out identity are really just the flip of the other side. So there's no fluidity. It's not as flexible. You can't just be anyone you want to be. You're sort of born with who you are. So in some cases, that's very limiting. In others, that provides, or another way of thinking of it is that it provides stability, consistency, you're reliable, you have a deeper sense of self that kind of safeguards you against the world where maybe a lot of bad things are happening, but you at least know who you are sort of deep inside. If you take that and counter it with the outside-in kind of identity, if your identity is based so much on the things that you do and the things that you have around you, if those things start falling down a little bit, you really lose your sense of self, and you really have a threat to your own sense of identity if your identity is based on outside things. So the inside-out version, the structuralist version, while in some ways is limiting, in other ways it safeguards us against sort of bad things happening in the world. And one last thing to note is that most people see this sort of identity as inside-out identity. And in some cases, in most cases really, some identities are prioritized over other identities. So a lot of this is based on maybe demographics, skin color, age, race, all of those sorts of factors. And if you're sort of on the wrong side of the identity scale or the pyramid of prioritization of identity, it's sort of too bad for you. Again, that's back to kind of the limitations of being born, this is my identity, this is who I am. Not a lot of fluidity or flexibility in shaping or reshaping your identity under this kind of structuralist identity system. In the end, it's probably actually a little bit of both. Some actions are for show and to show that you fit in, but there's also probably some truth to that. Some sense of identity is innate, and in some cases uncontrollable. So our feelings, our emotions that get tied up into it might be so innate that it isn't a sort of rational thought or like I'm doing this to achieve a certain goal to be defined as a fan. It just sort of happens that you're cheering for something and you have an emotional response to it. In terms of defining a fan, it probably comes down to a little bit of both. So there are some things like caring, getting emotionally invested in something that is maybe a little bit more innate, loyalty. But there are also some things related to practice, regular actions that you do, wearing team colors that are maybe a bit more for show and to show that you fit in as a fan. And we'll leave the conversation there for now. We'll certainly pick up a lot more discussion of identity as we move forward, but I just want to sort of lay the groundwork of how we might think of identity as either actions that define us or the sort of the self that's inside us that defines our actions or that guides our actions, or maybe it's a little bit of both.